Thank you, Mr. President. And I just want to talk about the last time we did tax reform, 1986. 1986, I was in the 6th grade. I had just come back from Camp Chile, from 6th grade camp. I think the Atari 7800 was the popular model, the popular thing that we all wanted for Christmas. I believe the Ford LTD station wagon was rolling off the assembly lines that year. I think Top Gun was the #1 movie at the box office. That was 1986. Why is 1986 important? 1986 is important because that's the last time we did tax reform in this chamber. That's the last time we enacted meaningful, comprehensive tax reform. We have an incredible opportunity before us today. This Congress does. Our colleagues have an opportunity to grow this economy, to get wages growing again, to create opportunity for the American people that they haven't seen in far too long. Over the past decade, Americans are working harder than they ever have before. But what they've watched as the haves have more and the have-nots have less, and they're tired of it. We've seen wages growing, and we've seen wages stagnant, and work hours growing. And that's what this debate is about. This debate is about people who want to stand up for Coloradans, people around this country, to make sure that we grow this economy so that people can stop working 2-3 jobs that they have to now just to try to make ends meet, but they can start seeing, finally, wages grow. I'm going to be joined throughout this afternoon's debate by the class of 2014, members of the Senate who were elected in 2014 as a result of a message of economic opportunity. People from Georgia, people from North Carolina, senators from Georgia, North Carolina, West Virginia, elected from Arkansas, elected because we believed in an America that was growing again. We believed in America that didn't have to settle for second place. It didn't have to settle for mediocrity or decline, but an America that with the right economic policies, the right tax policies, we could lift the burden off the backs of the American people, off the backs of American businesses, and get this country back to work. That's what this debate is about. Over the past several weeks, we've heard a lot of debate about what the Senate bill is going to be, what the House bill is going to be. Over the past several years, the Senate Finance Committee has held over 70 committee hearings on the issue of tax reform. Countless reports, paperwork done, economic models to show what this tax reform needed to look like. Open debates, both sides of the aisle, a chance to say, how do we reduce the tax burden on American people and get this economy moving again? And what the Senate has come up with is a package that is estimated to create 1 million jobs across this country. 1 million jobs across this country, according to the Tax Foundation. In Colorado, that means a $3,000 plus increase average after tax income. And if you don't think $3,000 is a heck of a lot of money to people, look at the statistics. The statistics show that the average American family, significant percentages of American families, don't have 24-hour access to just a few $100s. They don't have access to just a couple $100s in a 24-hour time period. A third of Americans, if they had to come up with $500 today, it would be a fiscal crisis for their household. We're talking about an opportunity to grow wages. In fact, the Tax Foundation says a 4.4% increase in average after-tax income will occur as a result of the Senate bill. Now, I'm going to yield to my colleague from Georgia. We're going to get out of your way with this easel, but I want to show one chart here and how wage growth can grow. If you look across the world, around the globe, and you see nations that have low statutory tax rates, and you see nations that have high statutory tax rates, you will see that those nations that have the lowest statutory corporate tax rate see the highest wage growth. People who work in these countries with low statutory tax rates, they see the highest average wage growth. People who have people who have high statutory tax rates, countries with high statutory tax rates, this red line right here, their wage growth is less than 1%. And you know where the United States falls? The United States falls as the highest statutory corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. Our wage growth is at the bottom. Low tax rates result in high wage growth. This fight is for the middle class of America. This fight is for hardworking American families. This fight is to grow wages across the state of Colorado, from the Eastern Plains to the Western Slope, and around this country. And I hope that all of us will be engaged in this fight. Now I'm going to turn over this debate to our colleague from Georgia who has experience in business, who understands how taxes work, and he understands how to make sure he's providing for the people of Georgia. We'll get the easel out of the way and just would turn it over to the gentleman from Georgia.
Well, I'd like to thank my colleague from Colorado. I won't tell him what I was doing in 1986, the last time we adjusted this tax rate, but I just want to remind our colleagues today that we're in a moment of crisis in the United States. Today, we have a national debt crisis. I've been to this floor many times, many of you have as well, to talk about this debt crisis. It affects our ability to do the things that we know are right to do, to deal with the victims of hurricanes, to deal with the national security, to deal with our health care situation. But folks, we're losing the right to do the right thing. To solve this national debt crisis, we have to do many things. But one of the ways that we can deal with this debt crisis, and one of the first things we have to do, is to grow our economy. The way to grow the economy is to roll back regulations, unleash our energy potential, and yes, finally, once and for all, fix this archaic tax system that keeps us from being competitive with the rest of the world. In 1986, we had the third lowest corporate tax rate in history in the world. And over the next 15 years, we benefited from that. But at the same time, the more our economy grew, the lower tax rates were taken in the rest of the world. Today, American businesses are taxed at one of the highest rates in the developed world, 35%. Meanwhile, Japan, for example, statutory corporate rate is just 23%, Mr. President. Germany is at 16%. Mexico is at 30%, and the UK reduced theirs in 2009 from 30% to 19%, and they're about to go to 17% as we speak. The average rate, as a matter of fact, in Europe is just 18%, while in Asia, the average corporate tax rate is 20%. Now, why is corporate tax rate so important to an American worker? The corporate tax rate that we have in America is the greatest burden the American worker has today. Why? Because it makes the American corporation less competitive with the rest of the world. It also makes that American corporation vulnerable to foreign acquisitions of U.S. companies, and then the moving of those headquarters and factories and jobs offshore. The number one thing we can do for the American worker, Mr. President, is to become competitive from a tax standpoint with the rest of the world. I've lived this. I lived in Asia, I lived in Europe, I've worked here most of my career. And I know when this gets out of balance, and it's out of balance today, and we're penalizing the American worker because of it. It's no secret, a lower corporate tax rate would make us more competitive globally. Our tax plan, as a matter of fact, fixes this. We're one of the last countries that still has a tax on unrepatriated earnings. In other words, if we have a U.S. company and it makes money overseas, it pays tax over there, we bring it back over here, we have to pay tax here. That double taxation, Mr. President, we're the last country in the world that really does that. We need to end that repatriation tax so that we can free up almost $3 trillion of U.S. profits overseas and bring them back and invest in training, in plants, in facilities, and in research and development. Our plan makes that happen. We have an individual tax code, Mr. President, that's 2.4 million words in length. Let me say that again. 2.4 million words in length. Wasn't the name of the 1986 tax law? Wasn't that the tax simplification law of 1986? I think it was. 2.4 million words in length. That's ridiculous. And it's entirely too complex. We all know that. Our plan will fix this. It's estimated also that this tax plan, if we can get it enacted, will create over 1 million new jobs because of the changes that we are developing into this tax code change right now. It's estimated that in addition to that, the GDP growth will be more like 3.7% instead of the 1.9% we got used to over the last 8 years. And I believe, frankly, there's no reason why it can't be significantly more. We're getting closer to getting this done, but I realize there's a lot more to do, Mr. President. It's more important now than ever that we don't get bogged down in this Washington dysfunction in gridlock. Last week, I mentioned that many Democrats supported the changes that we're talking about in the tax code right up until President Trump took office. In fact, over the last several years, over the last several decades, many people on the other side of the aisle and people in their place before, Democrats in our country, agreed. This is not a partisan issue, Mr. President. This is about national security, if you want to get right down to it. It's about making America competitive again. Who would be against that? There are decades of quotes, Mr. President, from Democrats and Republicans about this issue. This should be a bipartisan issue. In 1963, a very famous American made this quote: "A tax cut means higher family income and higher business profits and a balanced federal budget." In 1963, every taxpayer in his family will have more money left over after taxes. Every businessman can keep a higher percentage of his or her profits in his or her cash register to put it to work expanding or improving his business. And as the national income grows, the federal government will ultimately end up with more revenues. Now, that noted American was President John F. Kennedy in 1963. If he were here today, I think he would admonish all of us to put our partisan bickering aside and get something like this done for the American people. Another quote, and I quote, "I think the corporate rate should be lowered. We should try to get it as close to the international average as we can, so we will once and for all be competitive." Bill Clinton, last year, 2016. Another quote, and I quote, "Get rid of the loopholes, level the playing field, and use the savings to lower the corporate tax rate for the first time in 25 years. President Barack Obama in 2011, believe it or not. This is not a partisan issue. There are more minority party leaders in the House and the Senate that have also come out and spoken on this point. I quote, "Today, 28 OECD countries and every other G7 country has adopted some form of territorial tax system. And all these countries have lower corporate tax rates than the United States. This means that no matter what jurisdiction a U.S. multinational company is competing in, they're competing at a disadvantage." That was current Senate Minority Leader in 2015. This is not a partisan issue. Another quote, and I quote, "It was long past time for tax reform that would lower the corporate tax rate," unquote. House Minority Leader Pelosi last year. This is not a partisan issue. This tax bill is being done under regular order, Mr. President, including a committee markup with plenty of amendments this week. It will go to the floor as soon as we can get it there for debate and more amendments. I urge all my colleagues, let's put partisan politics aside once and for all and collaborate through the amendment process to do something historic here, something that American workers deserve, and that is to become competitive with the rest of the world again. Renew your support for the same tax changes your party has supported for years. I want to close with another quote from an individual I've long admired, President John F. Kennedy in 1962. I repeat, our practical choice is not between a tax cut deficit and a budget surplus. It is between two kinds of deficits, a chronic deficit of inertia as the unwanted result of inadequate revenues and a restricted economy, or a temporary deficit of transition resulting from a tax cut designed to boost the economy, increase tax revenues, and achieve, I believe, and I believe this can be done, a budget surplus. The first type of deficit is a sign of waste and weakness. The second reflects an investment in the future. Again, words from President John F. Kennedy while he was president in 1962. Mr. President, this is not a partisan issue. Our tax plan is an investment in our future, just as John Kennedy said. It's an investment that will help all Americans. I know there's a lot of disinformation going on, Mr. President. This is only a tax break for the wealthy and so forth. When the facts come out, and that's already come out, there are 4 Pinocchios been given to those comments. Our tax plan will prove that if we get into the details. Equally important of getting this tax plan done to help all Americans, it's a critical part of developing a long-term plan to solve this national debt crisis. Mr. President, I'm proud to serve here with my colleague from North Carolina, Senator Tillis. I think in North Carolina they actually did this, and they had the results that we're talking about here.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Georgia and my colleague from Colorado for their comments and the future comments of some of my colleagues that are in the class of 2014. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk a little bit about facts and fiction and some of the things that you'll observe here. In fact, I think probably the Kennedy Center is the only place you could go and see a bigger theatrical performance than what you're going to see on this floor over the next couple of weeks, because they're simply not consistent with what we're trying to do here. And I want to talk a little bit about it. Let's start with some of the fiction. We've had a number of people. I was just presiding before I came off the dais about 30 minutes ago, and I heard a 30-minute speech from someone who said that they haven't seen the bill, said that it's been passed in the dark of night, that it's not being discussed in committee. But then they went on to have a 30-minute description of why the bill's bad. Now, how could you not have seen something and have such a definitive position on the provisions of the bill? It's just curious to me. But here's something that's even more curious. There are so many members, many of them friends on the other side of the aisle, that are making a false claim that we're somehow going to raise taxes on working families, the middle class. Why would that make sense? What on earth would the voters of the United States, my voters in North Carolina, do to me next year if I came out and I declared victory because I raised taxes on middle income and working families? It doesn't make sense, and it's been proven to be false. The Washington Post has this rating system that they use. They call it a Pinocchio system. One Pinocchio means, you're probably stretching the truth a little bit. 4 Pinocchios means there's not a shred of truth in what you're saying. And these claims about raising taxes on working families and middle-income families earned them 4 Pinocchios. It's fiction. What we're trying to do is provide a tax break to the people who need it the most, to the people who are trying to pay their bills, struggling to go to school, struggling to actually just pay the rent. That's what this tax bill is about. This tax cut is about getting the economy back on track so that we can also drive up wages. So not only do we want to provide you with more money in your pocketbook and in your wallet at the end of the month by reducing your tax burden, we want to make it more likely that you're going to make more money, you're going to get a better job, and you're going to have more income at the end of this process, and I firmly believe that it will work. Let's talk about the facts of this plan. The facts are we have to have tax relief. We have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. There's no way that the greatest economy that's ever existed should be one of the least welcoming and least hospitable to jobs growth. That's why we've got to reduce the corporate tax rate. We've also got to reduce the tax rate on small businesses. In North Carolina, 80% of all the jobs created in North Carolina are created by small businesses. The people that the gentleman from Colorado referred to as the rich people are small business owners who actually file their taxes through their individual income. So they have a fair amount of revenue, perhaps. A lot of that has to go to pay for the business, and a little bit's left behind for them and their families and their employees. We've got to reduce the tax burden on small businesses so they can create more jobs and hopefully someday become very large businesses, hopefully corporations, creating more and more jobs and more opportunities for more workers. And at the end of the day, the middle income tax break is going to be somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 a year. From state to state, it'll vary a little bit, but that's a lot of money in these very difficult times. But more important than that are the opportunities that will get created through economic growth. And that's what I'll leave you with. I've seen this happen. First off, I've seen the false claims before. They were waged against me when I was the Speaker of the House in North Carolina, and we had the courage in the middle of a fiscal crisis to cut taxes and grow jobs. We had all the liberal media. We had some of my good friends on the other side of the aisle that I agreed with on many other issues that disagreed with us on tax reform. But in North Carolina, no one is complaining about the tax reform results. In fact, we've got one of the fastest growing state economies in the United States today after being in the 4th quartile just 5 or 6 years ago. We've seen our median incomes go up. We've seen the number of people lifted out of poverty at high levels. I know that it works. It's not easy, but it's a promise that we made to the American people last year, and it's a promise we're going to keep, this Congress is going to keep in the coming weeks. And when we do this, then we can start working on an economy that can pay down the debt and make sure that these young people that are pages here and the young people up in the gallery right now, you may not know this, but you owe about $70,000 on average to the federal government. That's your share of the national debt. I don't want you to have to pay it back. I want an economy that's growing that can ultimately resolve our debt problem, but you can only do it by producing growth. You can only do it by becoming economically competitive, and you can only do it by lifting the tax burden on businesses and working families so that that money can flow back through the private economy and out of the coffers in Washington. So I thank my colleagues for the hard work on this bill. I look forward to voting for the bill. I know that it's going to produce a result because I've seen it produce a result in my experience as Speaker of the House. It will work for America. It'll be one of the great things that we're going to do in this Congress. And at this point, again, I want to thank my colleagues. I believe I'm going to pass it off to the Senator from Louisiana.
Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it does not take a genius to see that something is stalling the American economy. Now, the economy's been better lately. I think, frankly, in anticipation of the United States Congress passing these tax cuts. But the fact remains that 2016 was the 11th straight year that our economy, the greatest economy in the history of the world, the strongest economy in the history of the world, even when it has the flu, 2016 was the 11th straight year that we have failed to achieve 3% annual growth, which has been our average every year since 1960. Now, something's wrong. And those experts I talked about, they tried everything. They tried monetary policy, changing interest rates. They tried deficit spending. Remember President Obama's stimulus program? They tried the Federal Reserve has tried quantitative easing out the wazoo. The experts have tried everything except what they should have done first. And that's let the American people keep more of the money they earn. Because they can spend that money they earn better than government can. Now, we've got two groups of policymakers in Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, this is what it's come down to. And I'm not talking about liberals or conservatives. I'm not talking about Republicans and Democrats. The two groups that I'm talking about are as follows. We've got one group of policymakers in Washington who believe in more freedom. And we've got another group of policymakers in Washington who believe in more free stuff. Now, I'm not criticizing policymakers for wanting to help people who are less fortunate than us. The fact of the matter is that the United States taxpayer at the state and the local level spends $1 trillion a year helping people less fortunate than us. And that money didn't just fall for heaven. We thank heaven for it, but it came out of people's pockets. We spend $1 trillion a year in our country helping people who are less fortunate than us. In our country, if you are homeless, we house you. If you're hungry, we feed you. If you're too poor to be sick, we will pay for your doctor. And I am very proud of that. So I'm not criticizing. In fact, I join my colleagues in wanting to help people who are less fortunate than us. But the fact of the matter is it takes money. And that money is generated by the American taxpayer, and the American taxpayer is not generating very much because the American taxpayer is not making very much. Now, let me talk to you about the middle class. I could talk about the business side of this bill, and this is going to help every business in America. It's going to help C-Corps, LLCs, sub-S's, family farms, single proprietorships. It's going to help large business women and businessmen, and it's going to help small business women and businessmen. But I want to talk about the personal income tax side. This bill will give a tax cut to just about every American. I know our opponents can probably find one or two people under certain circumstances that aren't going to get a tax cut. But the fact remains that if you look at the Joint Committee on the Budget's numbers, If you make between $20,000 and $30,000 a year, on average, you're going to get a 10% tax cut. If you make between $50,000 and $70,000 a year, you're going to get right around a 7% tax cut. If you make $1 million or more a year, you're going to get roughly a 5% tax cut. The middle class, and I consider, we can debate on what the middle class is, but I consider the middle class to be somewhere between $30,000 and $100,000 a year. You can pick your own definition. They're the ones that I'm concerned about the most, not exclusively the most. And let me tell you what this bill is about in terms of our middle class. This, the wallet, their wallet, because the middle class are angry in this country, and they ought to be angry. They tell me every day, they say, Kennedy, I get up every day, I go to work, I obey the law, I pay my taxes, I try to do the right thing by my children, I try to teach my kids morals, I try to save for retirement, but I'm getting fed up. Because they tell me, Kennedy, I look around and I see a rigged economy. I see too many undeserving people at the top getting bailouts, cutting corners and making deals. And I see too many undeserving people at the bottom getting handouts. And I'm in the middle. And I get stuck with the bill. And I can't pay it anymore, Kennedy. Because my health insurance has gone up, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, and my kids' tuition has gone up. My taxes have gone up, but I tell you what hadn't gone up. My income. Now, these are the American people, the middle class. They're busy earning a living. They may not read Aristotle every day, but they're smart, and they get it. And they know that median household income in America today is basically the same as it was in 1999. And for that, every policymaker responsible for that fact in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere ought to hide their heads in a bag. Now, this bill is going to fix that. And that's why it's so incredibly important that we pass it. Yes, it's important for our business community. Yes, it's important for the large corporations. Yes, it's important to repatriate those trillions of dollars. But at the end of the day, it's important primarily for ordinary people, you and me, the people who get up every day and go to work and obey the law and pay their taxes and have made this country great. They've hurt long enough. With that, Mr. President, I yield to my colleague. We call him a silver-tongued devil. He's so eloquent. From Colorado.
I thank the gentleman from Louisiana for that, and recognize the gentlelady from West Virginia for comments on why this is important to the country.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank, Mr. President, thank you. I'd like to thank the senator from Colorado for his leadership in bringing us, the class of 2014, to the floor to talk about the common sense tax reform measure that we have the opportunity of decades to make a difference, a big difference in many of the lives of the people that we represent. And I would even say most lives. This is like the 6th time I've been down to the floor to talk about what I think is the best tax reform package I've seen in my time here, and also the different aspects of tax reform that I think are great for the country, but great for my state. I represent a small state of West Virginia. So I am really glad to be, I've talked about small business and families and what it means for them, simplification, creating a competitive environment. But there's nothing like going home and talking to people, whether you're at the grocery store or this past week, we were all in Veterans Day parades, and people are generally so respectful and very happy at a Veterans Day parade. I can't say the same for every parade, but I will say for the Veterans Day parade, they're generally pretty happy. And I was really surprised because I had several constituents, not just one or two, but several saying to me, pass this bill, we want tax relief, totally unsolicited. So West Virginians are paying attention to what we're doing here in the Senate. Right now, our colleagues on the Finance Committee are working to advance this bill as early as tomorrow, and we are very hopeful that we'll be able to consider this bill on the floor of the U.S. Senate the week we get back from Thanksgiving, as our colleagues in the House are passing their bill this week. But you know what? It's been disappointing to me and really to everybody, I think, involved in this, is tax reform has become a partisan issue, an exercise. We have shared goals. We all want to go to the same place in this country, a prosperous place where everybody can thrive and succeed. But to turn your back on what I think is a well-thought-out, much-studied plan on tax relief, I think is to turn a blind eye to just every working American, every American business, every American family. And personally, I don't think it's fair. Our goals are shared by many Americans, regardless of their party, because we want to grow small businesses. I am in a state that has 95% of our businesses are small businesses. We want to allow that small business to make the decision to grow employment opportunities or raise wages. We want to make our bigger companies competitive globally. People say, you know, well, what's a big company really going to do for me working and living here in West Virginia? Well, I think if we looked at the major companies that are invested in our state, we know that making those companies more competitive will make them, will result in those companies creating more jobs, investing more capital, buying more products, raising wages for workers. So making our companies competitive globally is exceedingly important. We want to make sure that the middle-class family that's working and struggling, and I've heard many of my colleagues say that statistics show that many American families can't even come up with $400 for an emergency expenditure in their family. I mean, that's almost a flat tire, and you know, and the towing expense to get your car fixed so you can go to work or take your kids to school or get to your job, get to your church. So I think the tax reform bill in the Senate meets many of these objectives. The nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation has found that the bill would provide tax relief to Americans in every single income category, with the largest percent, and this was after working the bill over several months, the largest percent going where it should go, which is to the middle income earner. The Tax Foundation has also found, with the Senate bill, as many as 925,000 new jobs can be created. That's significant. That's significant because I believe some of those jobs, and I would hope a great deal of them, would land in the great state of West Virginia. And in West Virginia, the studies show that the average middle-income family would gain $1,952 in after-tax income, and the job creation for the state of West Virginia, 4,784 jobs in our state. Now, for some people, that might sound like not very much, but in our state, that's significant. And almost 5,000 more jobs, I'll take them, we'll take them, and we'll provide good workers for them, too. And $1,900 more from your taxes, that is a major infusion of cash into a family to make the decisions that they want, that they make around their kitchen tables, not the decisions that we're making here on the floor. Yesterday, I heard from members of the West Virginia Chamber of Commerce, and Steve Roberts, who's the president of that group, said, a quote, that our current system is full of, quote, negative consequences and reduces a business's ability to hire new workers, invest in inventory and equipment, and boost our employee pay. These are the hallmarks. What he's saying here is the negative consequences are the hallmarks of what we're fixing and what we're reforming in this bill. He noted that employers are eager to grow, reinvest, reward employees with better wages. We hope Congress will act quickly to reduce and simplify taxes, ensuring a stronger and economically vigorous nation. This is something I don't think we talk about either. If we have economic security in our families and economic security in this country, we're stronger in a lot of ways that go beyond being stronger economically. Think about in your family, if you have a decision you have to make, you have to come up with some emergency funds. If you have to go and borrow or try to figure out a way to meet ends meet, it makes you feel weaker. If you can do it yourself, you're stronger. And that's what we're doing in this bill. I also want to talk about the transparency here. We're hearing criticisms that, oh, this is coming in the dead of night, nobody's ever heard of it. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Finance Committee alone has held 70 hearings on this since the year 2011. Senators from both parties have had the opportunity to weigh in, both from experts inside the Capitol and outside the Capitol. And it's undergoing right now a full markup in committee. The House has had the same procedure. This is total light in the day. This is how legislation is made. And so I am very pleased that the tax reform principles in this bill is moving through our Senate. We know the president is very enthusiastic about this. He will sign a bill that will grow our economy and benefits what he wants to benefit and what we all want, which are those middle-income families. So, each senator has a choice here. We all have our choices. My friends from South Dakota and Oklahoma and Louisiana and Colorado on the floor with me. We all have choices every day. In Arkansas, Mr. President, you can either cling to the status quo and say, yeah, everything's working well, or you can really grab this and say, this is good. This is good policy. This is good politics. This will make our country stronger and our families stronger. So this will help our small businesses thrive, create more jobs, raise wages, and above all else, benefit our families. I think it's more growth, it's more opportunity. The people that I represent want this. They want to have more of their money at the end of the day, make their own decisions. They want their good hard work rewarded. They want to see a country that grows and is optimistic and is strong and powerful, and economic strength can give us that. I just heard from a 70-year-old postal worker from Wheeling, West Virginia. He wrote to me saying, quote, the Senate needs to get these tax cuts and tax reform done, end of quote. That's the simple way most people communicate in this country. I understand that. I hope our friends on the other side of the aisle understand that. It would be great to have us join together as a Senate, as a country, to do something we know is going to have the right results, the right consequences, and the right results, again, of growing this country, providing the relief that people want with a well-studied process, with well-researched data, and with the power of the American people behind us. Thank you. And now I would yield to my colleague from Colorado and thank him again for leading this.
I thank the gentlelady from West Virginia. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that at 2:50, Senator Rounds be recognized as the leader of the colloquy.
Without objection. Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, our economy is stuck. We've had about between 1.4 and 1.9% growth over the last 10 years. Compare that to the 10-year cycles before that, over and over again, all the way back to the Great Depression. Every year in a 10-year block, every group of that was 3% or more growth. Literally, we've had half the growth in our economy in the last 10 years than we've had in any 10-year time period going all the way back to the Great Depression. We've got to be able to deal with that. I hear people over and over again say, the regulations are choking out our business, it's driving up the cost of products for consumers, but our tax code is full of loopholes, it's full of confusion, it's complicated. Deductions, when I go through it to fill out my individual taxes, seem like they're deductions for everybody else but me. And people want to get that fixed. And quite frankly, no one likes paying taxes, and everyone wants to make sure whatever taxes they pay are spent efficiently and is the lowest possible. I can't tell them that right now because their spending is not on track and is not efficient. And I can also not tell them it's as low as possible. We need to fix that. The tax reform that we have in discussion in the Senate right now deals with some very basic things, beginning with more take-home pay for individuals. You can either be paid more by an employer or you can be taxed less by the government. Either one of those increases the take-home pay. This solves the tax less by the government so that individuals can have more take-home pay, around $100 a month. That's serious money for most Oklahomans, is to be able to have that amount of money to be able to come back into their family. The way that happens It starts with a standard deduction that doubles. It's $24,000. To say it flat, you would make between $0 and $24,000 as a family, and you wouldn't have any tax on that first $24,000 at all. That's a great help. So your tax doesn't even begin until after $24,000 at all. You'd be in that 0% bracket. We've doubled the child tax credit. For families that are raising kids, it's exceptionally helpful to them to have a larger tax credit. And then we take out the individual mandate in Obamacare. We've already had folks that have said, what does Obamacare have to do with tax policy? Well, let me tell you very simply. The individual mandate is a tax. That's what the Supreme Court labeled it as. That's what individuals understand it to be. If you don't buy the type of insurance that Washington, D.C. approves, you may buy some different insurance, but if it's not the one that Washington, D.C. approves, you get an additional tax penalty on your tax. Who pays for that? Well, in Oklahoma, 81% of the people who pay the individual mandate tax penalty make $50,000 or less a year. It is a tax directly at the middle class. I think that is unfair. We want to remove that tax penalty away from the middle class and to say they don't have that penalty and they're allowed to be able to buy insurance that they can actually afford. What does this mean for jobs? Well, if small businesses have a better tax code and their pass-throughs, they're able to hire additional people. That's more jobs. Based on where our economy is currently growing right now, the unemployment rate has continued to drop over the last several years. At the spot they're right now, that means there's more competition. There's more hiring, more people have to compete for those jobs. That means employers have to pay a little bit more money to get the people to be able to do it. That raises wages for people all around the country and have additional people that are not working now actually back to working. More people working are actually paying taxes, and it pays for itself. Getting a growing economy going is essential to us. And the way that you do that is you take care of the tax code for small businesses and you take care of the tax code for corporate businesses. I've had folks that have said to me, if you drop the corporate rate from 35% to 20%, what does that really do? Well, it allows, again, those big companies as well as the small companies to hire more people, to engage in more investment, to build more factories, to buy more machinery. That's what it allows them to be able to do, to grow their business. But on an international stage right now, our tax code's at 35%. If our tax code is at 35%, compare that to other countries that are somewhere around 22, 23, 24%, some of them less than that. Let me make it this simple. If you're going online to buy a shirt, and you can see that shirt for $20 on one website or $35 on another website, where do you buy the shirt? Probably from the one that is $20. If you're starting a business or founding a business and you can go in one spot where the tax rate's 20% or another spot where it's 35%, guess where they found the business? Where it's lower. We're the higher rate right now. If we don't fix that, businesses are going to continue to move overseas. And we can make fun of them in the news, we can yell at them and tell them they're un-American. They're going to continue to move where they pay less, exactly like every American does with their online shopping. That's fixable. In the middle of all this, we've got to deal with debt and deficit. We can't ignore that reality. And one of the things that I'm still going through in the proposal that we're working through right now are things that are unrealistic in the proposal. Because at the end of the day, we have to get the economy growing again, but we've got to deal with $500 billion in overspending from this government right now. We can do both. We've got to be able to do both. I'm encouraging this body to take seriously a proposal to be able to deal with how we get our economy going again. Let's figure out how to get it done, and then let's actually solve this for the American people. With that, I would yield to the senator from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. At this time, I'd like to thank our colleague from Oklahoma for his remarks. Once again, he's talked about some common sense solutions to our tax challenges in the United States today. At this time, I would like to recognize Senator Cassidy from Louisiana for his thoughts concerning what we have to do to fix our tax challenges within our country. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Senator Rounds, Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
The last 8 years, Mr. President, have been really hard for a lot of families. They've seen their wages stagnate, their benefits not go up. Indeed, what they've been paying for health insurance and flood insurance and many other things has risen, even though their wages have not. And so the goal of this bill is to decrease taxes upon those middle-income working families, to give them the opportunity to have better wages, better benefits, and to bring relief for situations that are peculiar to Louisiana. No, they're not peculiar to Louisiana, and I'll elaborate on that in just a second. Now, what could a middle-class family in Louisiana do with better wages? Well, they could pay off debt. They could provide more for their children. They could just live life a little bit more robustly, not have to perhaps move out of one home to another because they could no longer afford the mortgage on the first. So the goal of this is first to bring tax relief to working families and middle-class families, all part of an effort to cut taxes, particularly for them. But now let's talk about raising their wages. Folks want to have more money in their take-home pay after taxes, but they also want to have higher wages and better benefits. This bill definitely creates that. Our current tax code encourages companies to move overseas, and when they earn money overseas, keep it there, building plants and factories in other countries, employing folks in other countries, but not bringing that money home and employing Americans and raising wages and giving better benefits for those Americans. This changes that. Not only do we have tax cuts for the middle class, for working families, but we also encourage businesses to invest here to create better paying jobs here. And I've heard some say, well, wait a second, unemployment is low now, why does it matter? Now is the time in which workers most benefit. If there's investment creating more opportunity for those here in the United States, and there's a worker who is a welder, and he can either work here or there, businesses are going to bid for his services. They are going to pay more to get him to work. And as they do that, just from supply and demand, wages will go up for the average American worker, for the average American family. Benefits will rise for those families. The children of those families will have more opportunity. This is what that is about. And another way we bring relief to those middle-income families, part of what we're doing here is repealing the mandate of the Affordable Care Act. Americans hate the government telling them what to do. But as part of the Obamacare mandate, it tells someone, even if you can't afford that insurance, if you don't buy it, we're going to make you pay a fine. In 2015, more than 100,000 folks in Louisiana paid a fine for not having health insurance. 37%, almost 40% of those folks have an adjusted gross income of less than $25,000, 78% less than $50,000. Think about this. The families reporting an income of $50,000 or less, they can't afford insurance, and they're having to pay a fine because they have not. They're not millionaires and billionaires. These are families trying to make ends meet. They make a decision because the exchange policies are too expensive not to buy, and now they're getting fined. This is part of the relief we're bringing to those working families by getting rid of that mandate. And lastly, there's another form of relief. Louisiana had its great floods of 2016, similar to Maria, Irma, and Harvey, but this is an unnamed storm that affected tens of thousands of people. We bring disaster relief to the folks in Louisiana through this bill. And they'll be able to deduct their losses from their income, allowing them to rebuild their homes, allowing them to rebuild their businesses, and as they rebuild those businesses, allowing them to employ those who need a job to rebuild their homes, their lives. So, Mr. President, this bill cuts taxes for those families. It will increase their wages, and it brings relief not only from economic stagnation, but also from a natural disaster that is one of the most expensive storms in our nation's history. I'm very pleased that this bill is advancing. I look forward to it being passed, and I look forward most of all to the increased wages, the lower taxes, and the relief it brings to those families in Louisiana. Mr. President, I now yield the floor to the senator from South Dakota.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to thank Senator Cassidy for his words. Senator Cassidy is also a member of what we call our Bear Den, the class of 14. He came in here with the idea of getting things done. Another member of the class of 14 with us today is the senator from Alaska, Senator Sullivan. Senator Sullivan comes with a fine and distinguished career working in the United States military, but he's also got a strong interest in seeing the economic development in the United States continue. He recognizes the needs for tax relief. At this time, I'd like to turn the floor over, or I'd like to have Senator Sullivan speak. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Senator Rounds, and I appreciate all my colleagues coming down here. Actually, a lot of my colleagues from the class of 2014, and you know, Mr. President, we've actually, there's been a theme here, right? It's been talking about economic growth, talking about this challenge of what I've been referring to as a lost decade of economic growth. So when you talk about tax reform, you have to go back to the history. What do we mean by a lost decade? Well, Mr. President, I've been coming down the floor for, a couple years now with this chart. And this chart says a lot. This chart just looks at the history of the United States and where we have been with regard to economic growth. Bipartisan, Democrat, Republican administrations, decade after decade, starting with President Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. And what this chart tells you, Mr. President, is that right now something's wrong. We talk about GDP growth, but really GDP growth is a proxy for the health of the economy. And unfortunately, we've had a sick economy. GDP growth is a proxy for the American dream. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people over the last 10 years started to worry, is that something I can obtain? Let's look here, Mr. President. So every administration, doesn't matter, Democrat, Republican, really strong levels of growth. My colleague from Oklahoma was talking about at least 3% or higher since the Great Depression. Some of these years, Kennedy, Johnson. So right here, Mr. President, this line here is 3%. The red line, 3%. It's not great, but it's pretty good. Pretty good. You look at Reagan, Carter, there were years we were growing at 4, 5, 6, 7% growth. The pages right here looking at this chart, they don't even know what that means. They don't know what that means because what happened? Over the last 12 years, boom. You look at this. Everything is under 3%. The entire Obama administration years never hit 3% GDP growth once. Not once. There's a lot of talk about what makes America great in this town. You want to see what makes America great? Look at these years of growth. And it doesn't matter, Democrat, Republican, 3, 4, 5, heck, 8% during the Johnson administration. And now look, 3%. And you know what was surprising, Mr. President? To me, when I came here, nobody talked about this issue. Nobody talked about this issue, a lost decade of growth. And certainly, unfortunately, my colleagues, I've been here 3 years. I don't think I've heard my colleagues once come down on the Senate floor and go, holy cow, we got to fix this. A lost decade of growth, a sick economy, the proxy for the American dream going away, and nobody talks about it. You know, Mr. President, former Senator and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton wrote a book recently called What Happened? What Happened? Well, I think what happened is this. No growth for over 10 years. And nobody was talking about it. And I think a lot of people in this country said, I'm not going to throw away the American dream. I believe in the American dream. And the American dream means that we got to start growing at traditional levels of U.S. economic growth, at least above this red line, 3%. So I'm optimistic, Mr. President, because right now, for the first time in a long time, this body is really, really focused on this issue with policies that will hopefully get us there. Tax reform, regulatory reform, taking advantage of our huge energy opportunities, and so many other things. But that's why this discussion, this debate that we're having right now with regard to tax reform is so critical. Tax relief for middle-class families, tax relief for small businesses, and this bill, as you've heard, has many, many provisions that we think are going to help jumpstart this economy and get us back to at least 3% growth, at least this number where the red line is, that we haven't seen in well over a decade. So, Mr. President, these kind of policies that we're pursuing now that the White House is focused on, tax reform, energy, permitting reform, I would hope that every member of this body views this as probably the most important thing we can do right here, growing the U.S. economy with these kind of policies that have widespread support across the country. They certainly do in my state of Alaska. So I'm optimistic, and I'm also optimistic because the new administration, the Trump administration, is actually off to a good start. This chart actually goes to the end of the Obama administration. As you see, never really even came close to even 3%. Last 2 quarters of 2017, we actually hit 3%, 3.1 and 3%. We're off to a decent start, but this body must do much more, and I'm hopeful that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle can come down and talk about how important this is, because every American agrees with this. Growing the economy again, and tax reform is going to be a critical component of getting us there. So, Mr. President, Senator Rounds, I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words on this important topic. We'll be down here again, but growth, growth, growth has to be what we're focused on. Thank you.
Mr. President, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Senator Sullivan from Alaska. Once again, he comes in from the class of 2014, and we have a specific request to basically talk about what we see as being the appropriate way in which we create a healthy economy. I see that our colleague from Iowa has arrived, and if our colleague from Iowa, Senator Ernst, would care to speak, we would love to have her do that as well. Part of what Senator Sullivan has shared with you today is the need to move back above 3% growth, and that is an item which we think is critical. In doing so, not only does that begin to move back into what I think most Americans would consider to be a healthy economy, one in which they can actually see their own families doing better, but we'll also see a better movement in terms of the shortfalls within revenues coming into the federal government. And with that, let me just also once again welcome to the floor Senator Ernst from Iowa, also a Bear Den member, a class of 2014. Senator Ernst.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the senator from South Dakota's points, and glad to join in this conversation this afternoon. About a decade ago, the worst economic recession since the Great Depression devastated our middle class households, those families all across the country. And in its aftermath, our economy consistently underachieved. Last year, the United States saw less than a 2% increase in the amount of goods and services we produced. And the reason? Our stagnant economy has suffered from an outdated tax system that stifles economic growth through high tax rates and an unreasonable compliance burden. Small businesses, which I'm partial to, because they make up about 97% of employers in Iowa. Let me state that again. 97% of employers in Iowa are small businesses. They are taxed as much as 44.6% on their profits. Every year, these job creators spend over $18 billion just to comply with federal tax laws and regulations. Middle-class families and individuals around this country need some relief. By streamlining our cumbersome tax system and eliminating loopholes that primarily benefit the wealthy, Congress has an opportunity to lower tax rates for middle and lower income wage earners. Likewise, by creating a more competitive tax system for businesses, we can foster greater growth and investment in the United States and boost wages for more Iowans. Tax reform also provides Congress with an opportunity to lead by example and offer up its own unnecessary tax break. That's why I introduced the Stop Questionable, Unnecessary, and Excessive Allowances for Legislators Act, also known as the Squeal Act. This legislation would eliminate a provision of the tax code that allows members of Congress to deduct up to $3,000 annually in living expenses that they incur while in Washington, D.C. As we seek to achieve the ultimate goal of lowering rates for families and small businesses, Congress should start by eliminating handouts to our politicians. It's long overdue for our country to pursue a simpler tax code that provides much-needed relief for hardworking Iowans, that puts our economy back on track. I look forward to working with my colleagues on a path forward that reduces the burden of our complicated tax system, the burden that's placed upon our families, our hardworking individuals, and our small businesses. And with that, to the distinguished member from South Dakota, I will turn the floor back over to you, and thank you for accommodating the members of our class. And we are very hopeful that we'll be able to move forward with smart, effective tax reform.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to the senator from Iowa for her remarks. Once again, as we call it, Midwestern common sense. Mr. President, let me finish this colloquy today with just a few thoughts. First of all, we want tax reform, but what we really want is that healthy American economy. We think that's what the people of the United States want. They want the ability to compete. Over the last 10 years, there have been 4,700 businesses that have left our shores and moved overseas. And the reason for that is because they can actually survive better by leaving our country and going someplace else because of the tax consequences of doing so. So when we start talking about the direction that we want to go in this country, we want the people of America to understand our goal with this entire package is to make things better for the American public. That means a healthier economy for them. It also means by doing so that they'll see actually the bottom line in their own pockets, more money that they can spend that otherwise would go to the federal government. And at the same time, businesses that might leave and take jobs and the opportunity to invest their dollars, we want those back into the United States again, and to be able to hire more people, to pay better wages. We think the fact that over the last 10 years, the American public haven't seen those higher wages, we think that's because the competition for jobs has moved offshore, moved into the other parts of the world where they have a more competitive tax climate. But there's something else as well that I think we have to point out. We recognize that at the federal level, we have a deficit, and we have not been able to break that deficit. Today, we have a deficit which is in excess of $500 billion. Out of a $4.1 trillion total payments that are out there that we spend on an annual basis, our omnibus bill, as we call it, that's for the defense and the non-defense discretionary side of the formula, we voted about $1.1 trillion of the $4 trillion. There's about $3 trillion which is automatic, it's on autopilot. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest on the debt. If we want to close that gap, then we have to be able to see an economy which is growing, an economy which can support the programs that we believe are necessary, the safety nets that we in America have decided are very appropriate for those that have no place else to go. So if we want to close the deficit, we need no more revenues coming in. The only way we can pick up more revenues coming in is by having an economy which is strong enough to support that. So by actually reducing taxes, we bring in more businesses. Those businesses make more profits. We're able to, at a lower rate, tax profits, and that is returned back to the American people in a number of ways. First of all, a lower tax burden to themselves through personal income taxes and through subchapter S and C corporations through lower business taxes. But finally, and just as importantly, in terms of how we support the operations of government, we support that because with a growing economy, the revenue coming from that growing economy can be utilized to eliminate the debt, which is a threat to our national defense. So, Mr. President, at this time, I'd like to thank our colleagues who have patiently worked their way through this entire process. I'd like to thank the senator from Colorado for beginning this, and at this time, I would yield the floor.